Okay. All right. So tonight we are looking at John 3, 22 through the end of chapter 5. So it's a lot. Um, but when you kind of break it down into pieces, it's not quite as much. John is so incredibly wordy, which is part of the reason why I don't love this gospel. I'm already told y'all that. I know I'm shocked everybody by saying I don't particularly like this gospel, but tonight's reading is some of the reasons why sometimes this gospel gets on my nerves, because it can get kind of wordy. So it's helpful to just kind of step back out of it a little bit and not kind of get caught up in all of the nitty gritty details, but just kind of step back and look at kind of what the author is trying to put together in terms of this whole story. So the first section that we're looking at is this last encounter with John the Baptist. So we've seen John the Baptist kind of throughout. At this point, he's been the primary kind of bearer of the witness of the testimony of who Jesus is. And of course, these are early days to Jesus' ministry. So even though he's had a couple of signs and a couple of speeches and conversations up to this point, it's really been John the Baptist that is the one that's kind of telling us and pointing us the way. So human nature being human nature, maybe guys being guys too, to a certain extent. There's a lovely rivalry that happens right off the bat between John's disciples and Jesus's disciples. And we know already that some of John's disciples have left and gone to follow Jesus, which was exactly what John the Baptist wanted them to do. But those who have remained with John the Baptist are kind of scratching their heads and saying, well, Jesus now has more disciples than we do. What's that about? And we don't know, but maybe even, and again, we don't know, but it may be that even in John the writer's day, so, kind of however many decades later, 5 decades, maybe 50 plus years later, that there might even still be a few of kind of John's disciples around, that there's still kind of a little bit of jealousy. I don't know exactly, but that's a possibility, that the writer is actually having to address this rivalry kind of 60 years on. Who knows? But very human nature to kind of have this sense of, well, Jesus has more followers than we do. So what's going on there? And John the Baptist comes back with just this very clear kind of argument. He says, he kind of makes 2 points and then he tells a parable to illustrate them. The first point is that any followers that he has and any followers that Jesus has, they're all from God. So if Jesus has more followers, then they're gifts from God. So who are these folks to complain about Jesus having more followers? So a little bit convoluted, but it boils down to they're gifts from God. So what are you fussing about? So there's that. But the second argument that John makes, which is really even more powerful than the first, is I've already told you that this was going to happen. Have you not been listening to me? So it's kind of funny that he's having to say this to his own followers, that they're the ones that seem to be struggling with John's message, and this idea that John has said from the start, he is going to increase and I'm going to decrease. Like, that's how this is going to work, because I am here not to be the one, but to bear witness to the one. And so John just kind of says it again. This isn't about me. This is about him. And these disciples are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And so at this point, he uses the parable or the illustration of the bridegroom and like his best man, basically, to use kind of modern language. And the idea that the best man at the wedding the wedding isn't about the best man. His job is to support the bridegroom, and the best man's joy is on behalf of the bridegroom. It's not on his own behalf, it's for his friend. Which makes, I mean, that's a great illustration from Jesus's day to today. The idea of being, you know, if the wedding isn't about the best man, it is about the groom. And if you can't figure out how to be happy for the groom, then you probably shouldn't be the best man. Right? I mean, that's, you know, yeah.
When I read that, something just popped in my head about flashback to when Elizabeth was pregnant and the baby jumped in her womb, and I went, whoa.
Yeah, that idea of joy and just this kind of swelling up. I mean, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great connection between two stories that aren't even, you know, both included in this gospel, but that same kind of idea that John's expected this from the start. And there's I mean, you know, I love that. And the idea that John's content with this. This is because it's not about him. He's doing his job. And the disciples are the ones who are going to have to kind of figure it out and figure out what, you know, and it seems that some of them stayed with John to the end. And this is the, like, verse 30 is the final kind of word that we get from John the Baptist at this point, all these mini Johns. So this is his final testimony and witness to who Jesus is. And so he is going to kind of step out of the scene. He's going to decrease. And at this point, Jesus and his ministry are going to increase and do so at a very kind of rapid pace. Verses 31 through 36 are kind of this weird, like if you notice in 30, the quotation marks end. So John the Baptist finishes speaking. So the voice of who is speaking in kind of verses 31 through 36 is a little bit vague. But the point is essentially this: that Jesus comes from above is the most critical piece of understanding his identity. So we've talked all along about how John, the gospel writer, wants us to understand, I mean, he is writing this gospel in order that we, the readers, in our community of faith, whatever time, wherever that might be, that we come to understand who Jesus is, so that we can also understand that when we believe in who Jesus is, we have this abundant, extravagant life that God, you know, offers, and that, and like the sense of what it means to kind of believe in and follow Jesus. But we have to understand who Jesus is first. So John, the gospel writer, is doing a lot of work kind of laying out this identity of who is Jesus. So this section, the biggest thing is just this understanding that Jesus is coming from above. We've seen like bits and pieces of that. Obviously, the prologue hits that hard, but the gospel writer is reiterating that here. Jesus reveals the truth because he is sent by God. Jesus reveals the truth because he has the Holy Spirit. And Jesus is a valid witness to the will of God because of his relationship to God. So that's critical at this point. And with the end of chapter 3, we end John the Baptist ministry as far as the gospel writer is concerned. So John kind of exits stage left at this point. One commentator called John the Baptist like that he was like a midwife to Jesus's ministry. And I thought that was a really great imagery of what John's role was. He was to be the midwife, to kind of help get Jesus's ministry off and running. But he's going to exit, and from here on out, we're kind of focusing in on Jesus. So to step back a little bit, we've seen Jesus's first sign, the wedding at Cana. We've seen him call his first disciples. We've had his first this conversation with Nicodemus. A little bit of kind of controversy to start with as well, with the cleansing of the temple, right? So his first confrontation. As we step into chapter 4, now we see Jesus. So he's called his first disciples, he's performed his first sign, he's created his first controversy, and now he's gonna move the boundary of where his ministry reaches. So this extravagant, abundant grace of God that we saw on display in the wedding at Cana, and that he talked about with Nicodemus, and that the establishment seems to be kind of struggling to accept, Jesus is about to show it in a very real and controversial way as he steps out of Israel, out of Judea, and into Samaria. So again, I didn't bring my map with me, I forgot. But if you can imagine, again, Dead Sea to the south, Sea of Galilee to the north, Jordan River connects the two. Jerusalem's down here, up on a hill, remember, because you always go up to Jerusalem. And Galilee is to the north. Jesus is traveling between Galilee to Jerusalem, has been in Jerusalem, and is now headed back to Galilee. He has some choices as to how he's going to get there. Most good Jewish folks of Jesus's day are going to go kind of east. Sorry, my sense of direction at 7:30 at night is not going to be great. They're going to go east, around kind of up the Jordan River, but they're going to kind of step into safer territory. The other option is to go directly north, at which point he's going to cross into Samaria. Most Jews aren't going to do that. Why? Because there's a rivalry and a kind of innate hatred between Jews and Samaritans. And so most good Jews are going to avoid that area. Jesus, however, chooses, for whatever reason, expediency, to make a point, who knows, but Jesus goes directly through Samaria. And so that's where we get this amazing encounter of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well. Not going to get into details about why these two groups of people don't like each other. It goes back to like the 700 BC, Second Kings. I mean, it goes back lots of generations. The rivalry was renewed in around 200 BC. So kind of the last 200 years before Jesus's time, the rivalry was particularly a big deal. And there are lots of issues, but the biggest one, the biggest kind of challenge between these two groups of people is a dispute over the correct place to worship God. So the Samaritans have their own worship site. They believe it to be kind of the holiest of holy places and the place where you kind of proper worship of God. Of course, for the rest of Israel, or for Israel, the correct place for worship of God is going to be the temple in Jerusalem. And so it's a debate about the location of the worship site. It's not a debate about God. It's not a debate about that kind of stuff. It's where we worship. I kind of think it sounds a lot like traditional versus contemporary, but anyway, that's maybe another story for another day, but that's their beef. So in chapter 4, we have this encounter. And gosh, so it breaks down into kind of a great like storytelling pattern. We have this introduction, we have a conversation between Jesus and the woman, then we have this transition passage where the disciples show up and the woman leaves. And then we have this conversation between Jesus and his disciples. And then we have a conclusion where the townspeople show up. So the gospel writer kind of gives us this very kind of compact and flowing story with a very clear kind of beginning and end, which is helpful. There's a ton of Old Testament imagery here, right? If you read throughout the Old Testament, important things happen at the well, namely engagements. Lots of people get engaged at wells. Jacob, Isaac, Moses meets his future wife at a well. So that's a big place for that. Of course, it's Jacob's well, so that in itself carries a great deal of Old Testament imagery. And if we think back to a different time period, Elijah encounters a widow of Sidon, also therefore an outsider, so she wouldn't have been one of kind of Elijah's own people. He encounters that widow at a well. So for John's readers, the fact that Jesus is standing at this well and is about to have this encounter with this woman carries with it a lot of kind of weight, and that's important. The betrothal stories are kind of interesting because what has John the Baptist just compared Jesus to?
Right.
Now, no like Da Vinci Code conspiracy here. I mean, like, I'm not saying Jesus goes off and gets married, okay? But symbolically speaking, the idea of Jesus as a bridegroom encountering a Samaritan woman at a well has a really interesting kind of overtone of how Jesus sees his relationship with the Samaritans, and this understanding of Jesus kind of pushing this boundary into very unexpected places. So again, for Jewish readers, Jewish Christian readers, this is a very shocking story. So that's where we are. The other really kind of cool thing here is that we've just had this very long conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus. So let's think about Nicodemus. First of all, we know his name, which that in itself is a big deal, right? We encounter a lot of unnamed people throughout scripture, but we know Nicodemus's name. He is a man, and he is from the kind of established authority, right? Now Jesus is about to encounter an unnamed woman from Samaria. Outsider, unnamed, female. You think the gospel writer is setting us up to do some comparisons? I think so. So we should be paying attention to kind of the ways in which this woman responds to Jesus and how maybe Nicodemus didn't quite get there. Again, not to knock Nicodemus, but John, the gospel writer, is saying something about how this woman responds by kind of putting these two stories so close together. So the fact that Jesus talks to her at all is absolutely wild on a number of levels. So a Jewish man would have never spoken to an unknown woman, period. Okay, I mean, a woman that he knew or who knew him, yes, but an unknown woman, absolutely not. A teacher, so a well-respected rabbi in this day and age, wouldn't have spoken to a woman, period. And a Jew would never have spoken to a Samaritan. Okay, so completely wild that Jesus walks right up to her and says, "I'm thirsty, can you give me some water?" And so, yeah, she's very shocked by the fact that Jesus is speaking to her. Right away, we get into this double meaning, ambiguous phrase. In the same way that being born from anew had kind of multiple meanings, And poor Nicodemus kind of gets stuck in that. The idea of living water has multiple meanings, right? From a literal perspective, living water means flowing water. So as opposed to well water, which was still, living water was always preferable, right? It was cleaner, safer. It was life-giving to be around kind of flowing, living water. So that's a literal meaning. But of course, Jesus is also talking kind of under that surface level meaning of what he can offer, what God can offer. So the life-giving water. The woman, like Nicodemus, only hears the literal meaning of flowing water, which is why she's confused, right? Like, where are you going to get this water? How are you going to get it? You don't even have a bucket. Like, all she sees is the logistics and how they're not going to work. So that's where she kind of jumps. But where she differs slightly from Nicodemus is that she's willing to suspend her understanding of reality enough to say, well, gosh, if you have a better source of water, I'm willing to learn. So she's willing to kind of step in and say, I'm not real sure what you're talking about, but gosh, this sounds good. So I'm willing to kind of walk with you here. And so she is actually willing to continue the engagement and kind of continue the conversation. Again, not trying to kind of beat Nicodemus up for his lack, when chances are any of us in that room probably would have had similar reactions with Nicodemus. But it is an interesting kind of comparison. This unnamed Samaritan woman is at least willing to give Jesus the benefit of the doubt. So this is the point that Jesus says to her, and this is the kicker in the story, where we have a tendency to get caught up in the wrong thing. Because this is the point that Jesus says, go and call your husband. And she says, I have no husband. And Jesus points out that no, of course not. She's had 5 husbands. We have this real interesting tendency to make her a pretty horrible person at this point, right? I mean, dare I say it, but she sounds kind of slutty. She's had multiple husbands and she's living with a guy. That has a tendency to be the way that this story gets told. Stop assuming that she is responsible for the multiple husbands.
Is it the brother thing?
There's a real possibility that there's a Levirate marriage at play here, at which point we have a similar situation to Tamar, who is one of Jesus's own ancestors. Tamar was married to one of Judah's sons, if I remember this correctly. One of Judah's sons, he dies. She ends up with his brother in order to continue the first brother's line. He dies. You know, this happens a couple of times until the point where Judah's like, I'm not giving you another son, because and so she ends up having to trick her own father-in-law in order to carry on the name of her first husband. And Judah and then Matthew in his gospel kind of make some really bold statements about her righteousness, for her kind of tenacity here, that she was even more righteous than her father-in-law because she was willing to kind of keep pursuing this and being really persistent. So that's a whole other story, but this woman could be caught in a similar situation, at which point she's got nothing to do with the fact that she has 5 husbands. Also remember that women have absolutely no power to get a divorce. Their husbands can say with like one word, I divorce you, and walk out, at which point she's stuck, because she can't marry again. And going home to her father's house, like, maybe she can, maybe she can't, who knows. But women had absolutely no ability to divorce or to choose to divorce their husbands. where husbands would have had the ability to just turn around and walk out. It's one of the reasons why Jesus actually has to address the issue of divorce. It's not like kind of what we deal with today. I mean, we're talking literally, he could be like, well, you burnt the toast, and walk out the door, and she's stuck completely unprotected. So we have a tendency to get caught up in her misbehavior when Jesus actually offers absolutely no judgment on her. All he does is show her that he knows her. And that's exactly what he did with Nathaniel when he called Nathaniel, right? Like, I saw you under, the tree, you are righteous or faithful or whatever however he kind of identified Nathaniel. And it's at that point that Nathaniel is like, whoa, you really are a prophet. Jesus does exactly the same thing here. He shows her that he knows her. And it's at that point that she responds, wow, you really are a prophet. So yeah, let's not make her out to be a prostitute or something. We've already ruined Mary Magdalene's reputation. Let's not ruin the Samaritan woman's. Neither are listed anywhere in scripture as being less than good people. Okay, so let's not do this to her. So Jesus points out that he knows her. She responds with an attitude of faith in the same way that Nathaniel did. You, sir, are a prophet. And at this point, she's got a prophet in front of her, and he's Jewish at that. So she is bold enough and brave enough to ask him the $1 million question. Where are we supposed to be worshiping? That's the kicker, right? Like, that's the point of conflict. So now she's got him in front of her. She's going to ask that $1 million question. And so sure enough, she says, where are we supposed to be worshiping? And Jesus flips the script at this point and points out to her that the hour is coming when it's not going to matter where you worship. What's going to be most important to everybody is who you're worshiping. Okay. To a certain extent, we're kind of back to the temple and the overflowing of, or the overturning of the, of the money changers and whatnot, of Jesus kind of saying, like, at some point, it's not going to be about the day-to-day business. You're going to have to pay attention to when God shows up. And at some point, it's no longer going to be about the where or even how. It's going to be very much about who you're worshiping. And she gets it. But what she doesn't get is the immediacy of it, right? So she's like, yeah, okay, I'm with you. At some point in the Messiah is coming. When he comes, he will tell us everything that we need to know. I mean, it's a bold declaration of faith. What Jesus says back to her gets cleaned up in our English translation, but what he says back to her is absolutely incredible, because he answers her by saying, who you are speaking to, I am. So, the words that he kind of uses to introduce himself to her are pretty staggering, because he's just declared himself as the one that she's talking about. And it's at this point that she gets it. She's been willing to kind of go along with them, and she's kind of made strides in the right direction. But as soon as he says to her, I am, then that's it. And of course, it's at that point that the disciples arrive, kind of flew and interrupt the conversation. So the disciples come back. They are shocked because Jesus is talking to a woman. They're probably also not that shocked, because they're probably getting used to him doing weird things like this, because nobody actually asks, right? Like, they're like, ooh, but they step back and don't say anything. The woman leaves. notice that she leaves her jar of water behind. A quirky detail, but John, the gospel writer, has just told us by recording her actions that her gathering water is no longer primary for her. It's no longer the most essential thing. What is most important for her is for her to get back to her town and tell people about what she's just witnessed. So her kind of forgetting the water is just a detail that shows us she's not thinking about that anymore. She goes into the town, and what does she say? Come and see. Come and see. We've heard that before, I think.
Mm-hmm.
To come and see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? And the townspeople listened to her. So meanwhile, back at the well, Jesus has this conversation with his disciples. Not to get caught up in a ton of details, but he switches metaphors here from living water to the harvest and says to them exactly what he just told her, that the harvest is ready because he's here. So it's exactly the same thing that he's just said to her in terms of the immediacy of the arrival of God's kingdom. So the idea of the harvest, a plentiful harvest, would have been a good clue for any scripture reading Jew of the day that, God's, that was a sign of God's kingdom, or a metaphor for the arrival of God's kingdom. And so Jesus simply says, the harvest is at hand, and calls them to work. So he has that conversation. She's gone back into town. She started telling people. They actually believe her and listen to her, which is also to a certain extent a point in her favor, that she's not this bad girl that we make her out to be. Because if she was, I think she would have had a harder time kind of convincing people to come out and listen to her. But they do, and they head out to see for themselves. So they arrive and they ask him to stay with them. And now we're circling all the way back to that fun word, dwell. And Jesus dwells with them. Jesus stays with them for a couple of days. Again, the details that John includes are important. And of course, many more begin to believe, not just because of her testimony, but now because of his testimony. So he stays with them. And John now has told us that Jesus's ministry was not just and was never just for Israel, but it was always going to be for a broader, wider world. The other gospels include that message, but Matthew and Mark, especially, a little bit Luke, that Luke kind of includes the Gentiles from the start. But for the other gospel writers, Jesus's mission to those beyond Jerusalem, those beyond kind of Israel, doesn't have that ministry doesn't begin until after Jesus's resurrection. For John, that ministry begins immediately. It's one of the first things. So the placement of the story is also equally important, that it's this early in the gospel. So after he stays with them for a few days, he heads on back to Galilee, back home. If you are getting a little tired of kind of going up and down the country, it gets worse. We're going to make lots of trips up and down the country. Jesus spends a lot of time on the road in John's gospel. So they go back up to Galilee. It's again when he's in Cana of Galilee. There was an official in Capernaum whose son was ill. Based on the location, based on him being in Capernaum, and based on his job, it is possible that he's a Gentile. But the gospel writer doesn't give us those details. So he could be kind of an outsider himself, but we don't really know. He comes and he asks for healing for his son. And at this point, Jesus performs from a distance, his second sign, right? Like he's not even there. He's not even in the room, but he performs his second sign. And that is bringing this young boy back to life. And if you notice in verse 54, John, the gospel writer, says this is the second sign that Jesus did. So if you're keeping track, we're on number 2. So now we head into chapter 5, and there's a ton here because we have another healing, this time that Jesus initiates, and then we have a whole heck of a lot of controversy that happens because of the healing. So it's a very simple story to start with. It follows the kind of basic miracle pattern. They are in Jerusalem, so they've gone back to Jerusalem. Again, remember that every time he goes to Jerusalem, it's going to happen, whatever he does, whatever he says is going to happen in a really public way, and it's going to bring about a controversy with the establishment, right? It's like us going to DC. You know, we can shout all we want to from Greenville, South Carolina, or Clemson, South Carolina, or wherever, but when we get to DC and start shouting, it's a whole different game, right? So to a certain extent, Jesus can do some things in Galilee that maybe he can kind of get by with, but as soon as he shows up in Jerusalem, he's kind of right in the middle of confronting those who are in positions of authority. So he gets to Jerusalem, he's at, there are all of these kind of invalids who are laying around this pool that's supposed to be a place of healing. John, the gospel writer, tells us that there's this one man who's been an invalid for 38 years. Again, details are rare, so when they appear, we have to kind of wonder. There's nothing necessarily symbolic about the number 38. It just simply shows us that he's been ill for most, if not all, of his lifetime, right? So it's a very permanent condition. It's not like he just hurt his leg last week. He's been kind of permanently ill. And so that's what John kind of tells us about that. Again, it's Jesus who initiates the healing. Do you want to be healed? And the man kind of reacts with a bit of doubt, right? I mean, I don't, I've never been able to kind of be healed. I can't help myself in this, and nobody else has been around to kind of help me. And Jesus just simply says, get up, take your bed and walk. And the man does. Sign number 3. Great. Until we get to verse 9, in the second half of verse 9, at which point we learn that it was the Sabbath. So now Jesus has walked into a minefield. It's not that Jesus shouldn't have offered a life-giving healing on the Sabbath, but kind of to a certain extent, if the guy's been sick for 38 years, could it not have waited until Monday or Sunday, I guess, in this case, right? So could you not have waited one more day, Jesus, so that it wasn't on the Sabbath? Seems to be one of the arguments. And also for the man to pick up his mat and carry it has now caused the man to break the Sabbath laws. So Jesus has caused quite a bit of a kind of little deal here with his actions. And we don't know that when we're reading it. We kind of don't know it until after it's happened. And then we read how it's, how everybody kind of gets their back up. So why is breaking the Sabbath such a big deal? For Jewish people, after the exile, particularly, so generations before this point, I mean, we're talking like 587 here, BC. The 3 most important kind of identity markers were circumcision, keeping kosher, and Sabbath. So those were the things that no matter who was in control of the political area, they could control themselves, right? Like you could control what you ate, you could control how you marked your time, and you could control whether or not your baby was circumcised. Those were things that it didn't matter whether it was Herod or his son or a Roman emperor or a Greek emperor or whoever. Those were things that you had control over. Whether the temple was standing, whether it was not, whether you lived in Jerusalem or outside of Jerusalem, as most people did. Those were the three things that that would mark you as Jewish. So when Jesus starts kind of stepping on the rules of the Sabbath, he's stepping into a question of identity. And it hurts a little bit for the people who have been so kind of such sticklers about maintaining these identification markers. So you can kind of understand their point. I mean, these are things that when nothing else is under their control, they can control these things. And these are the things that can set people apart as being Jewish, of being God's people. So when Jesus seems to kind of be flippant about just pick up your mat and walk, then they can start to they start to butt heads. Of course, Jesus's response is that he is of God and he is doing God's will, and God offers life on the Sabbath or any other day. So he's not breaking any kind of Sabbath rules. And at this point, Jesus begins to compare himself or make this kind of bold statement that he and the Father are one. So now not only has he threatened this major identity marker of keeping the Sabbath, but he's now also compared himself and made himself equal to God. Jesus don't do those things in front of kind of the religious establishment of the day. But that's exactly what he's done. And so we read by verse 18, right? This was why the Jews, and again, we're not talking all Jews of all day, anyway, we're talking about those who opposed Jesus. This is why the opposition were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father and making himself equal with God. So for Jesus, Jewishness isn't the issue. It's their response to him that is the issue. He threatens power, he threatens their authority, and he threatens their perception of reality. But for Jesus, rejecting Jesus is rejecting a new way of knowing God. We're back to kind of the cleansing of the temple, right? It's not the temple. It's not the practices of the temple. It's the fact that God has just walked into the temple and nobody's noticed because they're too busy kind of doing their thing. It's not the Sabbath that's the problem. It's elsewhere in scripture, Jesus says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. It's not the Sabbath, that's the issue. It's not even keeping Sabbath, that's the issue. The issue is that they are literally looking at one who is from God and they can't recognize it. It's right in front of their face. That's the king. That's the thing for Jesus. And John, the gospel writer, seems to be kind of reminding us as readers that with Jesus, the defining identity, the mark of being a part of this community, of God's community, is now not going to be about specific practices. It's going to be first and foremost caught up in the incarnation. It's going to be first and foremost caught up in Jesus and who Jesus is. So in the same way that Jesus said to the woman at the well, the time is coming when it's not going to be about where you worship, it's going to be about who you worship. That's going to be what kind of is going to be the big question. Now Jesus is saying the time is at hand where it's not necessarily going to be about the practices, not that there's anything wrong with them, but that's not going to define you. What's going to define you is your belief in me as being of God. Okay, good. We're kind of on the same page there. So from kind of verse 19 on, Jesus jumps into this very long discourse, and John's gospel has several of them. Again, it's one of the reasons why John's gospel is particularly frustrating to read sometimes, because you get kind of caught up in this discourse and it's wordy. John has a tendency to use few words and then just repeat those words over and over again and like putting them in different sentence structures. So then you get lost in what you're reading. I mean, so it's not always the easiest thing to kind of read. So ultimately, there are two complaints. So let's kind of step out of the words themselves and kind of get into the basics of 19 through 47. There are two charges against Jesus. He healed on the Sabbath, and he makes himself equal to God. So from this point, Jesus now is kind of defending himself. So it reads almost as if he's on trial, and he is the defendant. He is defending himself against these charges. And so he's having to kind of show and prove that that he is doing the will of God. Now, he can't bear witness to himself or for himself, right? Like he can defend himself, he can be his own defense attorney, but he can't be his own witness. So Jesus is going to call to the stand, so to speak, some witnesses. The first witness that he calls to the stand is John the Baptist. Verse 33, you sent John, and he has borne witness to the truth. So John's told you, you heard him. Then he says in verse 36, I have given you even greater witnesses. So at this point, he's not pointing to himself so much as he's saying that his own works, Jesus's own works, bear witness to what Jesus is saying about who he is. So the second witness that he brings to the stand is his own works. Just confusing. The third witness is, and this is verse 37, the Father himself. So you heard at my baptism the Father's voice. He himself has borne witness about me. His voice you have never heard, his form you have never seen, and yet you do have his word abiding in you. So like he's called now to the stand the voice of God as found in Scripture and as heard at his baptism and whatnot. Okay. So he's now called to the stand all these witnesses. But all of a sudden, in verse 38, he switches the trial. And Jesus moves from being the defense attorney defending himself to being the prosecuting attorney, prosecuting those who oppose him. And he's now kind of accusing them of not having God's word in their heart, of not understanding the Scripture, of not recognizing him, even though they supposedly knew the Scriptures. This is John. This is John's gospel. This is the fun we kind of are diving into for 7 more weeks. But the discourse ultimately is about kind of Jesus pushing back against the opposition and making it clear why he's doing what he's doing. And why, if you were paying attention to what he was doing and to what is being said about him and who is speaking about him, you would recognize who he is. And so that, again, is why he's so frustrated by the opposition, is that they are supposed to be these kind of learned people. They're supposed to be the authorities, the leaders, and yet they themselves can't see and grasp who Jesus is and why this matters. Again, to be fair to them, chances are high we would probably be struggling as well. We like to think that we would all be like the Samaritan woman who gets it, right? Like we like to kind of see ourselves in her. the reality is that we might very well have been more like Nicodemus or more like these folks that are frustrated by Jesus's kind of lack of abiding by the rules and kind of staying in a nice, neat little box of doing what's expected. I mean, that's just unfortunately kind of the truth about human nature in general. And John, the gospel writer, knows this. And so as he's telling the story about who Jesus is, he's kind of calling the community of faith to see themselves at various points in the story. Don't be like them, be like her, or be like Nathaniel, or be, kind of see yourself as a disciple. Make sure you're not falling in kind of this category of those who oppose Jesus because they can't grasp that Jesus and the Father are one, and that he is doing the will of his Father. So that's the end of chapter 5. So yet another like fully packed couple of chapters from John. I mean, it's wild, but all of these stories are kind of flowing and fitting together, right? These themes kind of are connecting. The story of Nicodemus and the story of the Samaritan, the story of Jesus calling the disciples, and this idea of coming and come and see, and the cleansing of the temple, and now the healing on the Sabbath, and how these things are these themes are bubbling up, and they've all been kind of thrown at us in the prologue, and now John's just breaking it down a little bit.
So Joanna, why does chapter 5 not have a verse 4?
I have no idea.
This was explained to me because I had that question once for a pastor that I worked for.
Down, but I don't remember the response.
Well, he told me that as these were being translated and written down, whoever was translating them and writing up maybe got up to go to the bathroom or had lunch or something.
That sounds like a Steve.
That is
response.
a Steve.
That's a Steve response. Yeah, I think that's probably. Numbers and verses and chapters and all of that don't come around until much later in the game. So I think it's probably a clerical error.
Yeah.
Some monk somewhere, probably on the Isle of Iona, to be perfectly honest, Mom. Believe it or not, that's probably where he was sitting when he was translating some of the stuff. Because that's one of the few places that didn't get destroyed during the Dark Ages. So yeah, got up and went to the bathroom. That sounds like a reasonable response. I'm gonna go with that one. Nancy for the gold star tonight. I don't know. I'll have to go back and look, but to be perfectly honest, I never ran across that in
I just had a note written in my Bible, and I'm sure it was from another Bible study at some point in the past, that somebody had brought it up, because I didn't realize it.
I didn't either.
I think if Steve Morgan said it's probably true.
That sounds like a Steve Morgan kind of thing to say. Yeah, I mean, I'll go back and look it up, but my guess is that's a clerical error. Which, given how many times the Vikings kind of showed up on the Isle of Iona, he might have had to go
hide or something.
Yeah, hide, exactly. Who knows? But yeah, that probably somebody just lost count. Somebody like me doesn't count well. So they just lost count. So, other questions? Thoughts?
What's your definition of a parable? Because I always remember what my daddy's definition.
Well, share his first, because I'm not going to disagree with Buck.
A heavenly story with an earthly meaning.
Oh, I love it. That's a good one.
Well, and that's always stuck with me.
I like it.
It's exactly what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Yeah, I mean, the idea of a parable, the point of parable is never in and of itself. It's always to point to something beyond itself.
Mm-hmm.
So like any sign or means of grace, like communion or something like that, it's never about the act itself. It's always about what it points to. A parable is never about the story itself. It's always about kind of what it points to. So yeah, I mean, I think in that case, Uncle Buck was spot on. So I like that one. I might have to steal that from him at some point.
It just seems simple.
Yeah.
For my simple mind to understand.
Yep, I like it. Any other?
I did find this incredibly hard to read, and
Yes.
Yeah.
especially starting in the chapter 5, I was like,
Yeah, I question myself every week. Why are you doing the Gospel of John? Why did you pick this? But here we are. And I think when we get into stories like the Samaritan woman, and there's so much there, it's almost like it's worth it to wade through some of the other stuff. And we just have to be willing to kind of step away from some of the nitty gritty, like annoying passages, and kind of take them with a grain of salt and move on and see the bigger pictures and not get kind of caught up. And it's easy to get like bogged down in some of these, like, what exactly did John mean when he said, I mean, I don't know. But we can see the bigger themes. And I think if we can kind of hang out there, it makes John a little bit more palatable. But it can be hard. He's not the storyteller that Luke is by any stretch of the imagination. But there's good stuff. So, and it's authoritative. So we have to wade through it, whether we like it or not. Yeah.
It's too bad. I always just get the message and read it in that language, and that helps.
Yeah. Yeah.
that's cheating.
Hey.
Yeah, whatever it takes to get through it sometimes. But yeah, getting bogged down into some of these discourses can be the symbolic language and whatnot, and the convoluted kind of, just like Jesus is the defense attorney and then he becomes the prosecuting attorney. I never would have caught that. Like I just would have gotten lost in all of that. No matter how many times I read it. So sometimes it's helpful to just have somebody else say, read it like this, and then it makes a little bit more sense. So thank goodness for people that do this for a living, that have made their life studying just John's gospel. So, all right, let me press stop.